Picture a dry, wind-scoured canyon deep in the Nevada desert, miles from any modern road, where the rock walls rise vertically into a blinding blue sky. A surveyor mapping remote geological features in the late 1970s is rappelling down a sheer face of limestone when his boots touch a narrow, almost invisible ledge. He turns toward the rock, expecting to see a natural fissure or perhaps an empty alcove hollowed out by ancient water. Instead, he finds himself staring at a massive, heavily rusted iron door bolted directly into the solid stone, sealing the entrance to a deep cave. The metal is thick, pitted by centuries of brutal desert weather, and secured with heavy iron pins set into the living rock with poured lead. It is an impossible sight. And it is about to spark one of the quietest, most baffling debates in modern archaeology. Because when pieces of this iron were eventually analyzed in a laboratory, the metallurgical signatures did not match the industrial steel of the 19th-century silver miners who supposedly built it. The results suggested the iron was forged using methods that had vanished long before any documented European ever set foot in the Great Basin. And yet, there is another record, one much older than the laboratory tests. The indigenous people of this region have possessed an oral tradition for hundreds of years, detailing exactly who was driven into those caves and why they had to be sealed away. Today, we are going to tear this mystery apart, piece by piece. We will look at the chemical reality of the iron itself, at the deafening silence in the official mining archives, at the incredibly precise warnings kept alive by the tribes of the desert, and at the terrifying logistics of what it actually takes to bolt a 2,000-pound door into a sheer cliff. To understand how something this massive could be hidden in plain sight, you first have to understand the environment that kept it secret. Long before any prospector with a pickaxe arrived, before any federal map was drawn, the Great Basin was already a fully realized world. This is not an empty wasteland. It is a harsh, unforgiving, but deeply complex ecosystem of high desert valleys separated by towering mountain ranges. For thousands of years, the northern Paiute and the western Shoshone peoples have navigated this landscape. They knew where the hidden springs ran, when the pine nuts were ready for harvest, and which canyons held shelter from the bitter, snow-blind winters. And they also knew which canyons to avoid. To a casual observer, indigenous oral tradition is sometimes dismissed as mere folklore or campfire stories. But to the people who depended on this land for their very survival, oral history was a vital, practical map of reality. It was a strict record of environmental shifts, animal migrations, and historical events, passed from generation to generation with rigorous accuracy. If you alter the story, you lose the knowledge. And in the deep desert, losing knowledge means losing your life. So when their traditions speak of a time long before the current era, when a strange, violent group of outsiders arrived in the region, it is not a fairy tale. It is a recorded event. According to these generational accounts, a distinct group of people entered the territory. They were not native to the basin. The descriptions vary slightly depending on the specific region, but the core details remain astonishingly consistent. The outsiders were hostile, they looked different, they spoke an unrecognizable language, and most importantly, they possessed tools and weapons made of a strange, dark, unbreakable stone. The traditions recount prolonged conflicts, territorial battles fought across the valleys and up into the hills. The indigenous people, using the terrain to their advantage, eventually pushed these outsiders back, driving them up into the high, inaccessible cliffs where they sought refuge in the deep cave systems. And this is where the stories always end with the same chilling detail. The outsiders were cornered in the caves, and they were sealed inside. The elders never called this a legend. They treated it as a matter of historical fact, a violent chapter in the deep past that left a scar on the memory of the region. If you enjoy stories that the history books quietly skipped, consider subscribing because this channel lives on them. We are going to look at what happened when modern science finally collided with these ancient warnings. We will break down the metallurgical report that turned the official narrative upside down, examine the physical mechanics of how these barriers were constructed, explore why the standard historical timeline completely fails to explain the evidence, and reveal the one detail about the hinges that changes the entire nature of the mystery. Because years later, a completely different group of people arrived in these canyons, and what they recorded should not have matched the indigenous legend at all. But it did. The standard, comfortable explanation for anything metallic found in the Nevada mountains is silver mining. In the middle of the 19th century, the territory exploded with prospectors. Boomtowns sprang up overnight, and the mountains were hollowed out by men looking for the next Comstock lode. So when whispers of heavy iron doors and grates deep in the canyons began to circulate among hikers, ranchers, and land surveyors in the 20th century, the authorities dismissed them instantly. They said it was just leftover infrastructure from the 1860s or 70s. Miners often stored explosives, valuable ore, or equipment in natural caves and built heavy doors to keep out claim jumpers. It is a perfectly rational, logical explanation, and for a long time, everyone accepted it. But here is the part that should not be possible. When a team of independent researchers finally managed to secure a core sample from one of these heavily rusted grates in the late 1990s, they sent it to a university metallurgy lab for a full chemical analysis. They expected to find standard Bessemer steel or industrial cast iron, the exact kind of metal produced in massive quantities by the foundries of the 19th century and shipped westward on the railroads. What the laboratory found broke the timeline completely. The metal was not industrial steel. It was wrought iron, but it was forged in a remarkably primitive way. Modern industrial iron, even from the 1800s, has a specific, uniform chemical signature. It contains predictable levels of manganese and carbon, and the impurities are systematically burned out by high-heat blast furnaces. The iron from the canyon doors had almost no manganese. Instead, it was riddled with silicate slag inclusions, microscopic pockets of glassy waste material that are the undeniable hallmark of a bloomery furnace. A bloomery is a small, labor-intensive, low-heat forge that produces a spongy mass of iron called a bloom, which then has to be hammered by hand for hours to squeeze out the impurities. It is a method that was widely used in antiquity and the Middle Ages, but was entirely obsolete by the time the American West was settled. No 19th-century mining company would go to the immense, back-breaking trouble of building a medieval bloomery furnace in the middle of a desert canyon to forge a 2,000-pound door by hand when they could simply buy a factory-made steel vault door in San Francisco and put it on a wagon. Look at what this means. The metallurgy proves that whoever forged these doors did not have access to an industrialized supply chain. They had to find the iron ore locally. They had to build a primitive forge. They had to cut down hundreds of rare desert trees to make enough charcoal to fuel the fire. And they had to stand there in the blistering heat of a high desert canyon, hammering red-hot iron by hand, piece by piece, bar by heavy bar, until they had constructed a barrier massive enough to seal a cave. This was an act of absolute desperation, requiring incredible skill and staggering amounts of time. Now look at the geography. The doors are not located near any known silver or gold veins. Mining records from the era are meticulous. Claims were heavily documented because fortunes were at stake. But if you search the federal and state archives for the specific canyons where these doors are located, you will find complete silence. There are no claims. There are no assays. There is no record of any mining company ever operating on those cliffs. And then there is the physical reality of the site itself. Notice how these doors are anchored. They're not merely wedged into the rock. The builders used star drills to bore deep, precise holes into the solid limestone. They inserted heavy iron hinge pins into these holes, and then they poured molten lead into the gaps to secure them permanently. Lead expands slightly as it cools, locking the iron into the stone with a grip that can withstand centuries of erosion. This is a sophisticated engineering technique. It requires mining lead, smelting it on the edge of a cliff, and pouring it flawlessly before it hardens. You do not go to these lengths to build a temporary storage shed. You do this when you are building a fortress. Every time investigators tried to close the case by pointing to simple miners, one piece of evidence pulled it back open. The metal was too old in its composition, the location was entirely wrong for mining, the engineering was too permanent, and the sheer effort required to build it in isolation pointed to a narrative that history simply did not have a slot for. So, we are left with two accounts, separated by centuries, that should have nothing in common, and yet describe the same impossible thing. One of them has to be wrong, unless neither of them is. And just when investigators thought they had a pattern, one physical detail appeared on the doors that broke the official theory completely. For years, the few people who studied these sites assumed that whoever built the doors built them to protect themselves. If you were a lost group of explorers surrounded by hostile territory, you find a defensible cave, you build a heavy grate, and you lock yourself inside to survive. It makes perfect tactical sense. But there was something none of the early surveyors had paid close enough attention to. And when a structural engineer finally looked closely at the surviving hardware, the whole case changed shape. The hinges, the locking bars, the slide mechanisms intended to hold the heavy bolts. They were not mounted on the inside of the doors. They were mounted on the outside. This is the moment the whole case turns. Because if that detail is true, then the official explanation is not just incomplete, it is impossible. You do not build a heavy iron door, drill it into a cliff face, and place the locking mechanisms on the exterior if you are trying to keep yourself safe inside. You place the locks on the outside when you are trying to make sure that whatever is in that cave never comes out. Suddenly, the primitive bloomery iron, the immense desperation of the construction, and the remote location take on a much darker context. It forces a complete rethink of the timeline. If these were not miners protecting their ore, and if they were not explorers hiding from a threat, who possessed the knowledge to smelt iron, pour lead, and forge heavy grates, and why were they locking a cave from the outside? Some historians have cautiously pointed to the early Spanish Empire. In the 1500s, Spanish expeditions pushed violently into the American Southwest, searching for mythical cities of gold. We know about Coronado and De Soto, but the history of New Spain is also full of unauthorized, illegal expeditions, rogue bands of conquistadors, mercenaries, and native allies who vanished into the unmapped north and were never written about in the official archives of Seville. A lost Spanish column would have had blacksmiths. They would have known how to use a bloomery forge, how to locate iron ore, and how to pour lead. If a rogue expedition marched too far north into the Great Basin, ran out of supplies, and clashed with the local indigenous populations, they might have found themselves trapped. But this theory hits a wall when you look at the locks again. If the Spanish were the ones outside the cave, locking it, who was inside? And if the indigenous people were the ones outside, they did not have the metallurgical knowledge to forge the iron and pour the lead to lock the Spanish in. Now put the pieces together. The indigenous legend warned of an invading people who brought strange, dark metal and were eventually driven into the caves and sealed there. The metallurgical report proves the iron was forged on site using ancient, pre-industrial methods. And the physical hardware proves the caves were locked from the outside. 3 separate lines of evidence, spanning hundreds of years, none of them connected, all pointing to the exact same violent event, which leaves only 2 explanations. Either this is an extraordinary series of coincidences, a mining anomaly perfectly mimicking an ancient myth, or the story was never a myth at all. Someone with advanced metallurgical knowledge entered the Great Basin long before the textbooks say they should have. They built these doors. And then the dynamics of power shifted. Which brings us to the single question this whole story has been building toward. If the doors were locked from the outside, who turned the key? So here is what actually happened. Not the safe, comfortable official line, but the version every single piece of evidence finally points to. When we align the chemistry of the iron, the engineering of the hinges, and the memory of the Paiute and Shoshone, the contradiction dissolves into a single, cohesive, and terrifying historical event. The legend and the physical iron were never in conflict. They were describing the exact same moment from 2 different sides of history. Centuries ago, an undocumented group entered the Great Basin. Whether they were a lost, rogue element of the early Spanish Empire pushing far beyond their maps, or perhaps an even earlier Mesoamerican trading or mining expedition that possessed primitive smelting knowledge, they were heavily outnumbered and operating in a profoundly hostile environment. They had the technology to harvest local ore, build a bloomery, and forge iron. They likely found the caves and realized they were perfect natural fortresses. To secure their base, they spent grueling weeks forging heavy iron grates, drilling into the limestone, pouring the lead, and mounting the doors. They built these barriers to protect themselves, mounting the heavy hinges and locks on the inside, as any defensive force would. But wars in the desert are not won by stone and iron alone. They are won by water, by food, and by numbers. The local indigenous people, defending their ancestral territory from violent intruders, did not need to breach the iron doors. They simply needed to wait. They laid siege to the cliffs, they cut off the supply lines, the access to the springs, the routes to the pine nut groves. Eventually, the outsiders, starving and desperate inside their impregnable fortress, would have realized their perfect defense had become a perfect trap. And this is where the physical evidence and the oral tradition lock together with a final, chilling click. When the resistance of the outsiders finally broke, when the caves fell silent, the indigenous people did not simply leave. To ensure that the threat was permanently neutralized, to ensure that the caves were closed forever, they used the outsiders' own technology against them. They took the iron locking bars, the chains, the mechanisms that had been forged by the intruders, and they reworked them, securing the heavy grates from the outside. They did not need to know how to smelt the iron, they only needed to know how to drop the heavy bolts into place from the exterior, sealing the caves and leaving the invaders to the darkness. Think back to the evidence. The bloomery slag in the metal proves it was forged in a desperate, isolated camp, not an industrial factory. The poured lead proves it was intended to be a permanent, unmovable structure. The exterior locking mechanisms prove the final act of this conflict was a quarantine, a sealing of a tomb. And the oral tradition of the tribes proves that the memory of this event was kept vividly alive, passed down as a warning about the people who were driven into the rocks. We cannot prove the exact year this happened, and without further excavation of the caves themselves, we may never know the exact names or origins of the people who forged that iron. But of every explanation ever offered, from silver miners to elaborate hoaxes, this is the only one that leaves absolutely nothing unaccounted for. It honors the chemistry of the metal, the logistics of the site, and the spoken history of the people who survived to tell the tale. And that means the people who lived along that river and across those high desert valleys were right all along. They were not superstitious. They were not inventing monsters in the dark to frighten children. They were remembering a war. But the answer is not really where this story ends, because what it tells us about our own understanding of history is the part that lingers long after the metallurgical reports are filed away. We have a very arrogant habit in the modern world. We like to believe that history is a complete, finished document, neatly typed up in archives, and that anything that falls outside the official margins simply did not happen. We look at indigenous oral traditions as colorful folklore, completely missing the fact that oral transmission is one of the most resilient forms of data storage humanity has ever invented. Paper burns, archives flood, official expeditions lie to their kings and sponsors to cover up their failures. But a community whose survival depends on knowing exactly who walked through their valley will remember the truth for 1,000 years. This story is proof that the past is far more chaotic, far more porous, and far more violent than the clean lines on our historical maps suggest. Entire expeditions, heavily armed and technologically capable, can vanish into the expanse of the American continent, leaving behind nothing but a few rusted iron bars anchored in stone. It shows us how easily an entire body of knowledge, an entire group of people, can simply disappear when they collide with an environment and a people stronger than they are. And if you ever find yourself walking through a desert canyon and you notice a place where the locals lower their voices, where they avoid a certain ridge or a certain shadow for no reason you can easily see, maybe it is worth asking why, before you arrogantly decide there is nothing there. Remember that heavy, pitted iron door we started with? The one the surveyor found hanging silently on a sheer limestone cliff? Look at it again in your mind. It is no longer just an anomaly or a piece of forgotten mining trash. It is a monument to a desperate, unrecorded war. It is a tombstone forged by the people who died behind it. Some doors, once you finally understand why they were locked, you never want to see opened. So I want to ask you this. Is there a story like this from where you grew up? A local legend about a place in the woods, a sealed cave, or an old ruin that everyone knew about, but no one could officially prove? Tell me about it in the comments. I read them, and the history hidden in your local stories is exactly the kind of thing that drives this channel. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the strange, the overlooked, the stories the history books quietly skipped over, then make sure to subscribe. That is the only way you will catch the next investigation, and I promise you, there are far stranger things waiting in the archives. If this video kept you thinking all the way to the end, leaving a like genuinely helps more people find the channel. That is not a small thing. It is the entire reason independent historical research like this can survive. Thank you for staying with me, for weighing the evidence, and for keeping an open mind. Keep asking why the quiet places are so quiet, and I will see you in the next one.